Rain gently fell on the city sidewalks, reflecting neon lights in the puddles. People hurried home, their heads bowed, lost in their own worlds. Some stared at their phones, others waved for taxis. No one noticed the old man blending into the crowd, a shadow among moving figures. Inside a small cafe by the window, an elderly man sat alone, his trembling hands clutching a crumpled piece of paper. The words on the page blurred like raindrops on glass, but one line stabbed into his chest like a knife. Dear Richard Calloway, due to missed payments, foreclosure proceedings will begin on your property. Richard closed his eyes. For a brief moment, he saw the long hours he had worked, the sweat, the effort. He remembered the early mornings opening his bakery, the first customer walking in, the laughter of his children filling their home. Now, the only voice speaking to him was from a bank, cold, unfeeling, reduced to a piece of paper demanding money he no longer had. His coffee had gone cold, just like his hopes. He gazed at the faces outside. They were young, full of life, the world still shined for them, but he was just a shadow, unseen, unnoticed, forgotten. Just as he let out a deep sigh and closed his eyes, the cafe door swung open. A tall man walked in, his long coat damp from the rain. He ran his fingers through his wet hair, his sharp eyes scanning the room. People turned to look at him because he was a movie star, Keanu Reeves. But Keanu wasn't looking at them. His gaze was fixed on the old man in the corner. In a room full of people, he had spotted someone lost in loneliness. He was the kind of person who could feel that. Slowly, he walked over to Richard's table. His eyes moved over the crumpled paper, the untouched coffee, but most of all, the tired yet dignified look in Richard's eyes. Then, as if he were asking the most ordinary thing in the world, he spoke in a soft voice.
May I sit with you?
Richard looked up. One of the most famous faces in Hollywood was standing right in front of him, but in that moment, it didn't matter. Keanu Reeves being a celebrity was irrelevant. What truly struck Richard was something else. Someone was looking into his eyes. Someone had noticed him. For a moment, silence hung between them. Then, a faint, long-forgotten smile appeared on Richard's lips.
Sure, why not?
He said with a small nod. And just like that, the conversation that would change Richard's life began. Keanu sat down at the table, immediately noticing the dull, exhausted look in Richard's eyes. Deep lines traced his face, carrying the weight of years gone by. The silence between them stretched, but Keanu waited.
You look a little down. Did something happen?
Richard didn't lift his head at first. His fingers trembled as they gripped the edge of his coffee cup. He let out a quiet sigh, eyes drifting away as he finally spoke.
Down? Ha! I wish I were just a little down.
Keanu blinked, sensing the heaviness in his words.
Do you want to talk about it?
Richard shook his head at first, but then, as if releasing a burden too heavy to carry, he continued.
There's no one left who cares what happens to me. No one who loves me. No one who calls or checks in. You know, people don't truly die when their hearts stop beating. They die when they're forgotten. And I'm already gone.
His voice trembled, but his eyes didn't water. Perhaps even tears had abandoned him. Keanu slowly shook his head.
Just call me Keanu, and believe me, I want to hear your story.
Richard took a deep breath and placed the crumpled paper on the table. Keanu's eyes caught the large red letters printed across the top. Foreclosure. Richard saw Keanu reading it and let out a bitter chuckle.
You know, Keanu, I've always been a strong man. Even as a kid, I never wanted to be a burden to anyone. But life has a way of hitting you. Sometimes it slaps you hard, and sometimes it knocks you down so badly that you don't get back up.
He paused for a moment. His fingers reached for the sugar jar on the table, rolling a sugar cube between them absent-mindedly.
I was a mechanic when I was young. Then I opened a small bakery. I'd wake up at 4 a.m, bake the bread myself. I can still remember that smell. My wife would stumble into the kitchen, still half asleep, grabbing her coffee. My kids, they'd pack warm bread with cheese before heading off to school. I was happy then.
He fell silent. His gaze dropped to the table.
But when happiness lasts too long, life starts taking things away. My wife got sick. At first, we thought it was nothing serious, but it was. Insurance wasn't enough. We sold everything we had to save her, but we couldn't. I promised her, Keanu. I told her, I'll save you. But all I could do was watch her slip away. Then I was alone. And when you're alone, the pain stings even more. But it didn't end there.
Keanu spoke gently.
What happened?
I got sick too. Needed heart surgery. The doctor said I was lucky. Lucky? I walked out of that hospital drowning in debt. I lost my shop. My retirement savings were gone. The only thing I had left was my house. And now they're taking that too. Keanu, do you know a man's greatest fear?
Keanu studied the sorrow in Richard's eyes and slowly shook his head.
It's not dying. A man's greatest fear is disappearing without a trace. I was once a father, a husband, a friend, but now I'm just a burden. People like me? They don't make movies about us, do they?
He let out a hollow, bitter laugh. Keanu narrowed his eyes.
Maybe they should. Your story isn't over yet, Richard.
Richard shook his head, but the light in his eyes had long since faded, because to him, everything was already over. Days passed. Richard could no longer bring himself to even glance at the letters from the bank. He had done everything he could, but the outcome remained unchanged. One morning, a new envelope was slipped under his door. He hesitated before picking it up. His fingers trembled as he tore it open, and the moment his eyes scanned the content, they widened in disbelief. Outstanding balance, $0.00. His hands began to shake. His heart pounded. How was this possible? Without thinking, he grabbed the phone and dialed the bank.
There must be a mistake. My debt, it's been paid? Who paid it?
The bank representative cleared their throat.
I'm sorry, Mr. Calloway. Our donor wishes to remain anonymous.
Richard's hands slowly lowered, his vision blurred with tears. Who had done this? And then suddenly, a face flashed in his mind. That night at the cafe, the man who had listened. Richard spent days searching for Keanu Reeves. He scoured news articles, followed charity events, and asked around. Finally, he found him at a fundraiser. Keanu was there, mingling with the crowd, smiling, taking photos. But the moment his eyes met Richard's, a small, knowing smile appeared on his lips. Richard approached him, his voice barely above a whisper.
It was you, wasn't it?
Keanu shrugged casually.
I don't know, Richard. Maybe Santa Claus paid your bills.
Richard's lips quivered, his eyes filled with gratitude.
But why?
Keanu's smile faded into something softer, more serious.
Because I could. Because no one, especially a man who worked his whole life, should lose their home.
Richard couldn't hold back his tears any longer.
Thank you, Mr. Reeves. But how do I ever repay you?
Keanu slowly shook his head.
You don't. But maybe one day you'll help someone else.
Months later, Richard was still in his home. The nightmare of losing everything had passed, and for the first time in years, he slept soundly. But something had changed. One afternoon, he heard about a young man in the neighborhood, someone desperate for work, someone standing on the edge of the same hopelessness Richard had once known. And in that moment, Keanu's words echoed in his mind. One day, you'll help someone else. So Richard made a decision. He hired the young man, taught him how to bake, passed down the lessons he had spent a lifetime learning, because kindness is a chain that never breaks. And you? Would you help a stranger if you had the chance?